Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure for me to make this introduction. I've been working with Jerry, I guess, since about the mid-1990s, though I met him earlier than that. And he's been a great influence on me, like an older brother in the institution and against the institution. And so it's great to have him here, in particular to speak about this topic, which is the role of SFU itself in the 60s and the aftermath of the 60s. So I can't think of anybody who is better positioned with greater inside experience and reflection on this to speak about this topic. So I'm very pleased to have Jerry here. Jerry Zaslove is a teacher and writer who studied comparative literature at Western Reserve University and the University of Washington. Since 1965 at Simon Fraser University, he has taught literature and humanities, influenced but not limited by the traditions of the relationship of social radicalisms and the arts, the worlds of psychoanalysis and aesthetics. He is the founding director of the Institute for the Humanities and has published numerous essays and monographs. Currently, he is Simon's Fellow in Graduate Liberal Studies. A volume of his collected essays, Untimely Passages, Dossiers from the Other Shore, 1965 to 2015, is in preparation and will come out from Talon Books, I believe, Jerry. Yeah. So it's with great pleasure, the founding director of the Institute for the Humanities, which has continued, I think, the spirit of the 1960s at SFU as best as it has been able. It's a pleasure. Jerry.
Thank you, Ian. Ian and I have been colleagues and friends for a long time. As many of you know, we met at a time when there was so much transition going on in the university, which I will refer to in my talk. First, I want to apologize for not being able to hear many of the speakers yesterday because I had not been well. Can you hear me okay up there? Yes. I had not been well, and it wasn't in the cards for me to come. The title of my talk may puzzle you, a litmus test for the unpast, my personal reflections. I mean by that the past that's still with us and how to write history of that past. And I think the conference brings up that particular issue, and how do you write the history, as you'll see me saying here, of what in my own life was a traumatic period in the sense of upheaval. Coming to a new university in 1965, I didn't come as a draft dodger. Just a little quick anecdote. A relative I hadn't seen for many, many years, who lives down in Oregon now, came by on one of his obligatory Canadian trips through the wilderness and stopped to see me, and he said, some of my relatives thought I came to Canada as a draft dodger. And I thought, that's interesting. Myth, history, and understanding, how do those three get put together, right? Well, as a matter of fact, I came to Canada by choice in 1965 in a modified way as an exile. I had already, and this might surprise some of you, served 2 years in the army in Germany, and that was not as a draft dodger, but as a resistor. I told the first sergeant I wasn't going to shoot anybody, by the way. Okay, let me get to my points, which are basically thinking about why is it important to think about this subject now, right? Why is it important for me to reflect on it? And you'll see along the way that I'm weaving certain themes into this talk. One of the themes is the radical way of reading Hegel and the Owl of Minerva and let me just drop that in here, and I won't go back to explicate it. When philosophy paints its gray on gray, then has the form of life grown old, and when gray on gray, it cannot be rejuvenated, but only known. The owl of Minerva first takes flight with twilight closing in. In other words, for Hegel, can history be rejuvenated by means of understanding our mistakes? And how does self-understanding and self-consciousness come into play in understanding the lives we have led? While I was putting together some of these notes in a synoptic way, because I've published maybe 3 or 4 essays on this phenomenon of the Simon Fraser 60s and the university, I got a message, as we all did, about announcing Simon Fraser University's fall 2018 Data Visionary Series. From self-driving cars to flying robots, maritime law to railway clean tech transportation is rapidly evolving as the big data and artificial intelligence propel us in new directions. This is what I'm talking about. The nature of and you'll see as I go along, and this was on the agenda already in the 1960s. The nature of the administrative, bureaucratic, technological university versus what I'm calling the university that was evolving in a different way at that time, a new university in Canada, right? And that I had, in a way, the ambiguous privilege of being part of, right? As you'll see. So I'll be drawing on some of the things that I've written about. The 3 themes that I want to highlight here are, one is about public intellectuals, that the rise of public intellectuals in the 1960s in this ambiguous way came on the historical stage of British Columbia and Canada. Not that there weren't public intellectuals before, but public intellectuals were important to us in the 1960s. The second question is about the ambiguous question of SFU as a utopic or radical, as Hugh Johnston's book put it, the radical campus, which I reviewed for the CAUT bulletin once and kind of groused about the term radical for him. It's a very interesting book still. And the third is the unfinished project of the student's role in the critique of the university, in the critique of the market model university. 3 themes that I felt were very prominent at the time. I'm going to mention public intellectuals of then, first with a statement by the former president of Simon Fraser, Michael Stevenson. So what I'm talking about is my own personal, cultural, political, and it's in another way poetic history. This is not an economic history of the university, which is part of the urban real estate history of Vancouver, of the university, of the corporate urbanism that comes with the territory since the 1960s world of the marathon development and the Gold Corp, the massive development today on the Bentall-Trezec waterfront, right, which was not in existence in the 1960s. This is part of our students and the university's history insofar as where the urban development happened, which I call architectural Manhattanism or Goliathism. And one of the 60s themes is, as you'll see, is schooling, which became part of the economy based on fast growth, migration of people, the need for pools of labor, students as clients, the interlocking ownership of holding companies in banking, railroads, shipping, newspapers, TV, and communications industry. These lie, my voice might fail, but these lie behind what I'm saying. Herbert Marcuse, a paragon of the student movement, came here in 1967, invited by the political science and anthropology PSA departments to speak. He spoke to large crowds in the lecture theaters that were doubled. They had to have 2.5 lecture theaters to listen to him. And he wrote me a letter at the time because I had written him, and maybe at the end I'll quote from that letter. Now, what am I thinking about, or how has that world transformed? Michael Stevenson, a former president, looking back, and reflecting on his role as a public leader, not an intellectual, leader of universities, wrote Leadership Under Fire, the challenging role of the Canadian university president, the changes and underlying tensions in Canadian university life. So I'm taking this as a paradigm of what a president will say in public, right, and thinking who's listening to him. I'm quoting him. The pressure for growth and accessibility, coupled to declining real per capita grant funding for enrollment, the anonymity, bureaucratization, and managerialism that size, complexity, and unsustainable financing entail, and the increasingly instrumental interests of government and business in the university's contribution to labor supply. And to paraphrase, the pressures of external and internal stakeholders, that's the word we should ban entirely, by which he means students and citizens, right? For transparency and accountability in the use of public money. Add to these, he writes, the tensions around academic freedom produced by the increasing social diversity of the academic community. Who knows what he means by diversity, right? And by, I do, having lived through it. And the increasing environment, the never-ending demand for and cost of new technologies, the demands for institutional differentiation. What does he mean by that? It's bureaucratic president speak for new programs that address the question of political and cultural and social identity. That's what he means. Internal structure adjustment and retrench, the pressures to increase tuition, fees, research overhead, and external fundraising, and the increasing competitive environment for such funding. Okay. The president, this president, and others too, makes my argument for me. I doubt any president or board of governors would say anything different. His honesty is compelling for its naivete. What strikes me about this analysis of many years ago is he is not a public intellectual, but a spokesman. A spokesman. Does he tell the public this or that, this, or is it this? Does he tell the public the real competitive problems facing universities as an intellectual enterprise and as a research enterprise? How does he speak in public is my point. This was a question that was raised in the 1960s. How do teachers, students, administrators speak in public? What is a public intellectual? What is interesting about that comment is that he doesn't mention students. He only mentions the labor force obliquely, but for sure he doesn't mention the work for hire TAs. He doesn't mention about the pressures on intellectual life that comes by living and working in a modern university. So the public intellectual is what? That's the question. Why is the question important now, and what does it have to do with the university then and now? It has to do with the carrying out, in my view, the extension, the stretching of the social and ethical morality, ethical university as a social movement. The university as a social movement, excuse me, the university as a social movement and the accompanying academic freedom was on the agenda in the 1960s at Simon Fraser, and as I lived it. For example, there was no academic freedom and tenure brief in the 1960s. That had to be formulated on the run, right? And I was on the first academic freedom and tenure committee to kind of find the language for this, right? Along with other things being built on the run. Okay, I referred to that. Okay, freedom social is a social movement and the academic freedom to hear and speak criticism to those who have been trained to understand power and to criticize power and authority, not for themselves, but for the public good. This was the situation we were in then, but then when I think back as a partly historian of my own experience, do I idealize the then? So what about the now? The then university attempted to reach the public toward a public that was retreating from the dialogue because of conflicting pressures on itself as an idea of a public, right? In a world of performance indicators and the money economy dictating the organization of the university's resources, competing with UBC, for example, knowledge is a resource that becomes a commodity when understood as the property of the few. This was a dialogue in the 1960s. Who owns the fruits of our production? And how does it transmitted, delivered, formed, and how is it maintained as a tradition, right? That the control of intellectual property becomes the new universal knowledge commodity. The universities became a temple of exchange value. The New World Order came in at the end of the Cold War in the then 50s, in my own formation, when the intellectuals on both sides of the Iron Curtain were being watched for their political values, which became enemy values. The wave of prosperity that found a home in the 1960s after the Second World War found a home again in the 1980s when the Third World actors and the immigration movements came more and more into Vancouver. For a long time, and to change the landscape of the urban. For a long time, no one mentioned race, but the signs were there in the way the anthropology and sociology department in the 1960s, and that's a theme that I will come back to, in a politicized open university that was frightened by its own freedom at the then time. It was frightened about its role in the public sphere. It could not afford to offend by becoming public intellectuals, like, for example, when the David Noble case that some of you may know about, that happened in the early 2000s, when David Noble, a public intellectual who was often in the public in a loud, vociferous way criticizing the instrumental university as a labor historian, a labor sociologist. Noble was denied an appointment as the J.S. Woodsworth Research Chair at Simon Fraser because as a public intellectual, it was not only what he said, but that he said it in public rather loudly. Okay, so it was not what he did or his research was. And by the way, I was on a committee, co-chaired with Steve Duguid in the Humanities to hire David Noble. So I knew the story, although I retired shortly after that. It is because he used academia. He treated academia as a calling in Max Weber's sense, that is a calling, a vocation, and a way of entering into the public world, critically or philosophically, what Ian does. He performed the drama of speaking to power. I'm not idealizing David Noble. I'm drawing a story here out of the events of the time. In an age when teaching is assigned to part-time faculty or graduate students, when the average term, and this is speaking of Stevens, and this is ironic, for college presidents was not too long, maybe 3.9 years, not as long as an undergraduate program, and while the university downsizes somewhere, adopts emergency planning elsewhere, expands into suburbs where property is affordable, humanities grads continue to decline as a proportion of undergraduate degrees. These are figures from the 90s. I don't know what they are now, but what did increase by 5 or 10-fold in the 80s and 90s was in the US. This is a Harvard study, by the way, so you can trust it, right? Was computer and information services, protective surveillance services, transportation. By 1994, business had a fourfold advantage over English. 78% more degrees were granted in business than in English. The preliminary SAT, Scholastic Aptitude Test, indicates a 9% interest in English. The lowest salaries were in the humanities, and there were few or no consulting fees, secondary jobs, or outside incomes for us in the humanities. Teaching loads are high for sessionals. The universities were in a perpetual crisis. Trotsky would like that, right? And the cadre of brain workers, which I attribute to the university administrators, rather than intellectuals, are distinct until cadres of professoriate ended up in the administration, right, as they do now. Brain workers are distinct from intellectuals as an inevitable result of the situation where one does not rock the boat or come to conferences not in one's own field, for there's no interest for it on one's CV. That sounds cynical. Okay. The promise of money, finding a source for money, grants for research, this is what he's talking about, the president, to enhance the capacity of the university to adapt to a culture. This is a booming industry. If the size of administrative middle management is any indication, one cannot draw attention to oneself in public. The public intellectual was public not because he or she speaks in public, but because the intellectual challenges the power and cultural hegemony. We had a conference here on Gramsci with political identities tied to the fate of the intellectual that determines one's vocational identity. What has to be understood about the university in the 60s, here or elsewhere, is that the movements came out of the 50s into the 60s, in my own experience, through the side door, not the front door. What the counterculture introduced was the rhetorical and ideological expression of a transition from one stage of the welfare state to another value-added welfare state. It was played out in public, in education, music, literature, film, and theater, and new English departments that I came to in 1985, and there I see a few people who were in that department. And I'm going to speak a little bit about that. So SFU was a Canadian university as a social movement, was as a Canadian movement as well as an international one, because Simon Fraser was one of those new Canadian institutions, even in the famous mimicked architecture that recreates the illusion of Roman and Greek pantheons. New forms of schooling, however, which were interpreted as an epochal movement to address both power and schooling, were on the agenda. This was very much part of the so-called Simon Fraser radical revolution, the formation of the trimester system and small classes. Classes were tutorials. They were mentoring as well as additional teaching events, really, to large lecture. So the student teaching assistants who participated in a strike at a local high school, Templeton High School, which some of you may know about, right? Who were immediately deprived of their position as TAs in the PSA department. Was there a geography student there too? By the President McTaggart Cowan. Tom Bottomore, the head of the PSA department, and I were on a university ethics committee listening to the cause for dismissal of these TAs. How I got there is another story. Paul Goodman, in a felicitous phrase at the time, wrote a book where he described a school as a box with all the seats facing forward. Paul Goodman came here along with Marcuse and others to speak to students at the time. What was going on at the time in the 60s was that the market model university had not yet completely arrived. The utilitarian nature of the social agenda that always defined university's social and cultural capital was on the agenda. Was on the agenda in British Columbia, especially as a new urban university in a rapidly changing Vancouver was assimilating the university into the public sphere. The inevitable, I'm jumping here, the utilitarian function of the university in a market inspired the modernization of universities in British Columbia in a post-colonial period. In regard to the university, the Kantian goal of the autonomous individual, the educated individual, meant that this was a subject that was being placed into the classroom, into university governance, and into the controversies, right? The usefulness of education. Free schools were active in the 1960s, the alternative school movement at all levels, the basic foundation of the colonial version of the Kantian, Matthew Arnoldian, romantic, anti-capitalist trajectory of utopian education, sorry for the long sentence, was tutelage as the basic foundation of student and humanistic professorial consensus. There was a hidden consensus, right, which was unseated by what I'm calling the university as a social movement, okay? Habermas, following Humboldt and Kant, assumed that the state would become the ground, the mediator, and the patron of a cultural nation based on the autonomous individual. The critique of the state in culture and science became the utopian heart of a knowledge that is both permanent and future-oriented. In part, in these comments, I'm speaking on behalf of the ideal student at the time, right? The student and the kinds of conflicts that we experience in the classroom, and I'll say something about that. Both permanent and future-oriented, that now and will never be complete, not now and will never be, and will never not be the, and will never finish the unfinished project of the Enlightenment. However, this ideal of the unfinished project of the Enlightenment was a target, the double face of the state-owned university and the critique of the state as one of the roots of the new university as a social movement. On the one hand, however, the political project that emerged in the 60s, I'm talking about the post-colonial, post-war UNESCO educational project, is the aspect it took on in order to build a professional class of administrators and practice that would not be equivocal in not jeopardizing the primary value of the autonomous individual. To serve the state culture, the unity and teaching and research, mentoring and teaching entered into the social project of the university as a social movement. Cultural integration, socialization, and tradition were paramount in creating social and cultural capital. However, the ideological shadow that fell over the older universities in Canada was challenged by Simon Fraser University that came on the scene with its modernist rationality. You'll tell me when I should, if I'm, okay. Before this new type of university emerged, both Europe and England and the Americas, full of these countervailing and difficult contradictions, then when the market society and the training institutions collided, intellectuals versus brain workers, who organized productive models of research, this decline of the inner-directed university, which is a Habermas Kantian concept, the inner-directed university as the social and cultural capital and the ideological and instrumental nature of academic freedom on the one hand, and on the other, the social demand for accountability and legitimation of those like the public president, Stevenson. On the one hand, the inwardness of the cultural mandarins, the professoriate, and the expectation that we academics are privileged, the society of those mandarins would be apolitical, internally autonomous, full of the educational neo-humanist literature of its philosophical faculties. Within this struggle, however, there was another inner logic and an incommensurable, what I call warm stream of anarchical, communal, and sometimes Marxist utopic understanding that was founded on heretical dissidence with critical potential embedded in the subject matter that we were teaching and speaking. For example, I taught the UN Declaration of Human Rights at the time in the 1960s that was authored by a Canadian, John Humphreys, in 1946, co-authored with Eleanor Roosevelt, right? And he was a legal professor at McGill and ended up, I don't know, maybe somebody knows how he ended up on that, I don't know. The experiential, incommensurable, future-oriented, interpretive values of the poetic and theatrical, which were important in the English department and the School for Contemporary Arts, its predecessor at the time, evolved in the early period of the intellectual movements into different interpretive movements, the Foucault movements and other movements that happened after that. Okay. What was on the agenda in the 1960s, however, was an open admissions policy. The reform movements that came after 1960s were in literacy, criticism of the instrumental economy, cross-cultural, intercultural forces, and women's movements that emerged in the 70s and 80s. The rise of new genres of modernism and the second waves of decolonization in the humanities raised new discourses in the humanities. So what I'm saying is that internal to the universities at the time that were foregrounded and revealed in the movements at the time were the contradictions between the brain workers, the management, the administration that represented one aspect of the history of universities in the Canadian scene as well, and the other aspect, which was the lecture hall, the seminar, the spoken word, the poetic word, right? I was proud to be able to say, and still am, that I was part of an English department that was formed on the basis of a new poetics, a new modernism, and artists and poets who went on to win prizes and so forth, and poetic laureates and so forth. And, but that wasn't known at the time, right? This was part of the unknown history. Okay, so the Canadian, one other aspect, as I say, was the lecture hall, the seminar, the learning space, the tutelage and mentoring model, and the form of cooperative learning that was experimental, not just personnel-based or hierarchically organized. In other words, this is a history that has no history. How do you write the history of the classroom? How do you write the history of the dialogical world and the questions that come up in the classroom that remain unanswered or answered and go on into the next generation or are silenced by the world of the hegemonic world? The walls of the university, in other words, were a microcosm of the society and a social utopia for young citizens who were bound together by an oath of objectivity. Competence had to be measured, tested, licensing competence, which came in the 80s as the admissions criteria changed in the 1980s because high school teachers were not allowed to give the grades that universities felt were adequate. But this was not only a grade issue, it was about who is admissible into the university, right? So measured, tested, licensing compass was the camouflage, the protective coloration that would protect the university from adversaries beyond its walls. That is to say, academic freedom should be more than the freedom just to be academic. We were making our rules at the time in the 60s. Who would have the security of tenure that carried with it certain responsibilities of self-government and the obligation of objectivity that were preconditions of intellectual work. That is, intellectual work was no longer to be confused with manual labor. And there's a point here that Simon Fraser was established as a working class university of east of Commercial Drive, the suburbs in the Fraser Valley, and the students who came to Simon Fraser in that great period did typically not have parents or grandparents who went to universities. Now, okay. But intellectual labor was a human rights-based kind of labor that required us to turn the public sphere to join with social movements on the outside. So what were some of the influences of the 1960s period? And you probably heard some of these from Brian and others. The military-industrial complex was by then very well known to Canadians and Americans. That was the term used by Dwight Eisenhower in 1956. The Vietnam War, Quebec separatism, mass education, and the founding of new colleges and universities were the backdrop to the mass culture outside of the universities. Paris, 1968, the organization man, all of these themes influenced the movements in the 1960s here. The open borders to draft evaders, the previous speaker. McLuhanism, Trudeauism, urban modernism, the Kennedy assassination, the rise of an anarcho-Marxist humanist tradition, anti-traditional labor movements among student groups, new coalitions outside and inside. The anti-establishmentarian values look for further reform of the new universities because older disciplinary arrangements seem to be outdated. The idea of interdisciplinarity, which has become a kind of mantra now, was on the agenda. The Frankfurt School was coming on the scene. Roland Barthes, Godard, Black Mountain poetry gave playfulness a demonic quality to the most serious attempts to challenge the entrenched. In some way, what I am saying is that we had this double aura of the university as a social movement, but also as performing itself in public, right? That way, illuminated the boards of governors who came from corporate ownership of banking, transportation, mining, newspapers, and of course, behind all of this, the cultural memory of smaller nations like Canada were faced with the growing hegemony of large states and the rebuilding of Europe, which formed the way new universities in Britain. The American, Chinese, and Russian expansionism and the Cold War had been the ultimate arbiter of political change. However, beginning in the 60s, urban growth, colonial expansion, continued through the racialization of the cities in America and determined the way one thought of urban and municipal politics. An urban university with roots in the suburbs, the Fraser Valley, and the working class district sections of Vancouver were the students at the time. So when I'm highlighting the nature of the student, all this was either implicitly or explicitly in the 60s. The Liberal Humanist Alliance that marked the Diefenbaker, Pearson, Trudeau, Stanfield, Tommy Douglas, and the CCF NDP and the UN Declaration of Human Rights were part of the reality. The key events in that period of time were then the dialectics of complicity and accommodation. Specifically, the violence and the wars of liberation in South America and Asia, Cuba, and the beginning of an image of globalization as a political form of modern society. The violence underscored the contradictions of commodity capitalism and wage labor and the ensuing period of revolution of globalization that I call the traumatic war neurosis that has its roots in the 1950s and 60s. What people who, when I look back, don't understand is the traumatic nature of those changes that were going on both at Simon Fraser, lives destroyed, lives arrested, people who had to move, right? And the fate and destiny of the social movement of a university was put on hold through the 1970s and 80s, and as I say later on in the paper, that were whitewashed necessarily by the market model university who had to rewrite history or not know how to rewrite the history of the 60s. Does that make any sense? In terms of saying where I come into this drama, okay. At the Dialectics of Liberation contrast, I'm following through the theme of accommodation, complicity here. At the Dialectics of Liberation conference in London in 1967, Stokely Carmichael, Allen Ginsberg, Marcuse, Paul Goodman attended along with Angela Davis. The 50s, McCarthyism was in the background in America, while it appeared less in Canada. The expansion of the U.S. empire in Latin America was so important at the time. By the way, this was part of my own history as a graduate student in the University of Washington. The University of Washington was subjected in the 1950s to the Canwell Committee, which was an adjunct to the McCarthy Committee. And many of the professors I had as a graduate student in comparative literature were subjected to the examination by this Canwell Committee. So when I came to Canada in 1965, I was trailing, in a way, clouds of inglorious capital examination of the professoriate. There's been books written about that. The realization of the role in the 60s of technology in violence and the atrophy of utopian socialism. The Oppenheimer trials, the Rosenberg trials, Alger Hiss, the Korean War. Many of my friends went to the Korean War and some didn't come back. Some came back and committed suicide, right? The growth of the atomic bomb, the Cold War, and the Canadian complicity in building the bomb, which John O'Brien, the art historian at UBC, has written about. The wildcat strikes in Detroit, labor union accommodation, and the utopic wish for a student and labor collaboration, the underground anarchism that saw unions against revolution. Daniel Bell's work on, by the way, wildcat strikes in Detroit, Akron, and Cleveland in the industrial belt of that part of mid-America, which is on the agenda now in terms of. So let me go on. The complicity of American industry growth before the war was coming out in the 50s and 60s. The race issue that were behind the Students for the Democratic Society, SDS, movements and its parallels with the silence of Hollywood about the Holocaust were cultural socializing agencies. Figures who were on the scene and who were taught in the 1960s, about following my accommodation and fitting in model, were often taught in the classroom, sometimes directly in the classroom, were Hannah Arendt, Bruno Bettelheim, Stanley Milgram, Chomsky, Goodman, Psychoanalysis with a Human Face, Erich Fromm, Norman O. Brown. I sometimes snuck Freud into a class. These are names some will remember, but most of them are not regularly taught now. The free school movement in Canada, the journal, the magazine, this magazine about schools, Liberation magazine, Wilhelm Reich and his class consciousness, sexual freethinking, the anti-psychiatry movements, and so forth. The existential turn of Sartre and others around phenomenological existentialism, the friendliness toward maladies of the mind that showed up in the work of R.D. Laing and Kubler-Ross, and feminism and liberation trails these social and cultural movements which were active at the time. The kitchen sink movement in Britain, right? And texts of Anthony Burgess's The Clockwork Orange from the film from 1964, but their book was written in 1961. Translations from Bertolt Brecht, the films of Fellini and Antonioni, Godard, the SDS movement, the Weather Underground, and recently, of course, there were autobiographies of the people of that generation, including Bernardine Dorn, who became a professor of law, that have come out, rehashing the 60s, trying to come to terms historically with their own role in it. So the theme of my own preoccupation is, how do you write history after? And I think this is a theme of the whole conversation. How do you write history? Is it history as it as it actually was, wie es eigentlich war, in terms of Ranke's theory, or is it history, the last thing before the last, that's still happening, undergoing? Is that the history? These are two different ways of interpreting and understanding history. Rehashing the 60s, trying to come to terms with their own role. There were mythic types who were in the press. Carl Oglesby, for example, may not be familiar to anybody here. A folk singer, went to Vietnam, wrote a book about it, later became president of the SDS in Ann Arbor. In the 1950s, he was a close friend of mine. We sat on the back porch in small towns of Ohio talking about these kinds of things, tracing the lines of a cultural history. Carl went one way, I went another. I came to Canada. He went to see Pound in Washington. He became a folk singer, cut records, and spoke to vast hordes of people in Washington. I never spoke to vast hordes. The question, as did in the 1960s, as a movement, as a period, I call it a period of coming into existence of a kind of epochal consciousness of oneself as a period. One felt oneself as a period. The question as a movement, how are the protests on the campus against war now? Where are the protests now? And as one of the generational aspects of thinking back is that the political conditions of the 1960s produced the hundreds of thousands of people now who live in 10 cities, who are crossing borders as we speak, okay, and are subject to the surveillance, policing, immigration, residency requirements that have changed drastically since the war. At that time, it was easier to come to Canada. The characters in Pulp Fiction, the deer hunter, the great Bill Lebowski, whose brutality in those films is conditioned by wars, are far from America or Canada. These characters in these films I characterize in my classes as like Achilles in Troy. They fall apart in the movies. They fall apart, subject to the very trauma that was being lived in. They go berserk, actually. They go berserk. In The Big Lebowski, as well as Pulp Fiction, we are watching losers in the male con game. Con artists, drifters, crypto-fascists, dropouts whose relationship to protest has been broken by forces that do not have a political name or that they do not understand, but function nonetheless in an effective American or maverick American movement. The United States at that time was witnessed an exodus like you heard about it in the last talk, right? The flight, exile, refuge, sanctuary, asylum, and ultimately citizenship or landed immigrant status for Americans. The morality of the war, patriotism, political idealism were on the agenda in the 1960s. That's the theme, or the students. The fugitives came from many different backgrounds. Some were well-educated, some were dropouts, some were variously employed. Not since pre-revolutionary times when 80,000 Tories fled from the Revolutionary War, or one might say since the American Civil War, where underground railroads led the black slaves north, was there such an exodus or transmigration. One of the themes on the historical stage in the 1960s then at Simon Fraser was the question of exile, transmigration, and the formative nature of a new identity for people. There were many Canadian civil society, human rights organizations that helped with counselors in many cities and border towns. These organizations were monitored by the CSIS, the FBI, police, and the RCMP. But it was truly a mutual aid, anarcho-communitarian network of people. The border guards checked the National Crime Information Center, and the Bellingham Draft Board was very active. Many Americans, 10,000, stayed underground. Their choice was Sweden or Canada. When Canada was at war from 1939 to 1944, Canadian deserters were welcome in the US. I'm going to skip here to the end. In order to immigrate to Canada, there was a point system, as we know. Less educated, lower skilled had more problems. But you could marry a Canadian citizen, and a lot of draft dodgers, draft evaders married Canadian women. In 1992, there was a 90-day amnesty for illegal immigrants. 1,200 signed up for residency. In Sweden, the refugees had international status as international refugees. According to one study, most of the 210,000 named and accused draft resistors remained home and faced the law. 1/6 went into hiding. The great memorable Spiro Agnew, Nixon's vice president, had a nephew who went into underground. Nixon took the position that it was treason to oppose the war. Does that sound familiar? Before trying to change his mind as the body bags started to come in from Vietnam. Nixon aides, namely Pat Buchanan, labeled them the worst of a generation. In other words, this was a rhetoric, this was an ideological other that was prominent in the 60s for our students. They knew about this. They knew what was going on, and you could talk about it in the classroom. Pat Buchanan labeled them the worst of the generation, malingerers, opportunists, criminals, cowards, victims of character deficiency, in other words, psychologically sick, right? In other words, a psychopathological profile and a political profile combined, as it does now in the United States. And he says, I would swap a whole damn zoo for the kind of young Americans I saw in Vietnam. I'm coming to the end. The press looked at these draft dodgers and the people and students at Simon Fraser in a cynical way. In the summer of July 1967, I pointed to the Dialectics of Liberation Conference. There was also the Aldermaston anti-war demonstrations in London earlier than that. This gathering of psychiatrists and phenomenological figures at that Dialectical Liberation Conference brought Julian Beck of the Living Theater, Allen Ginsberg, Emmett Groban of the Diggers, contingents from the new experimental schools and colleges. The pantheon of the 60s lies deep in the foliage and ruins of that time. Others who were at the Congress, Marcuse, Carmichael, Goodman, Bateson. On the agenda was class analysis, the critique of schooling. A footnote here, which I'm not going to get into. At the time, there was many free schools emerged in Vancouver at the time. Alternative high schools, alternative forms of education. Dropouts from high schools went into these schools. On the agenda was class analysis, the critique of schooling, as I said. The absence of women in that Congress would not be noticed immediately. Soon the turn in the 70s to professions and economic recharging of the batteries would become the whitewashing project of the 1970s and 80s at Simon Fraser. By now, it's a memory that those 60s are what I call a memory hole in the radical memorabilia of that period. The turn in the 70s to professions, academic recharging of the batteries, the move into different forms of intellectual discourses happened in the 80s and 90s. So my themes here are the revolution, the university as a social revolution, summarizing, the educational and pedagogic changes in the classroom, the didactic classroom, and what you could stand for in the background was the university trying against history to transform itself, and did it fail or did it succeed? Migration, immigration, diaspora. If you look at the architectural of urban Vancouver, you can see the modernization that has taken place, which is the burying ground of that 60s as a visual aesthetic world. Okay, I'm coming to the end now. Habermas wrote in 1967, I just want to end with this because it's such a wonderful self-confession, ambiguous statement. He wrote, we sociologists have not reckoned with the possibility that students could play a political role in developed industrial societies. The values of status, mobile, and socially climbing middle-class families accord with the universalist values of the university tradition, the Kantian autonomous liberal values. Students were threatened and frightened that they were being reconstructed by the universities. He goes on to say that it was a psychological as well as a political and social change in this middle-class training ground where the university as a social movement came into historical existence. The student became a bartering chip. The essence of these classrooms, however, as I said before, cannot be explained by historical analysis. It has to be explained in another way. Marcuse, in his 1967 talk at Simon Fraser, declared, it refers to projects for social change that are considered impossible for reasons. At the time, Marcuse said the students were the incipient intelligentsia. But when the Vietnam War ended, the student movement as it was formed at that time ended as well. Other public intellectual movements like the women's movement, the colonial liberation movement, emerged throughout the world of the poor, but also helped to open up the world to the overwhelming spread of capitalism and the new state nation. Okay, the culture of the Cold War was lived out in both the desire for a radical pedagogical telos and a desire to open the doors of the university to more and more students. So competence was on the agenda. The critique of the university danced in tandem with the economic necessities to broaden the university to include more students, more of everything. Where is it now? My tongue-in-cheek is that we now have a Walmart model of the university, everything under one roof, right? The knowledge industry is the likely model of the university we live with now. Hegel's owl of Minerva, that I started out with, has to overcome the gray on gray to overcome itself in a form of historical productive understanding of the twilight and the mistakes we made or the mistakes that were made. And how do you write history in terms of the mistakes? Okay, I'm in there.